A Navy SEAL and his two children were thrown into a Montana winter with nothing but an old truck, a loyal dog, and whatever dignity a man can hold on to when the door closes behind him. What none of them knew on that frozen night on the road to Whitefish was that beneath the warped floorboards of a dying farmhouse 20 miles north, a chain of letters waited. Written by a woman who had seen all of this coming, who had spent the last months of her life making sure that when the moment arrived, her family would not be left without a map. His name was Caleb Merritt. He was 38 years old. He had served 15 years as a Navy SEAL, survived 3 deployments, held brothers as they took their last breaths on ground that no one back home could find on a map. He had come home. He had built a life. He had loved a woman named Nora with everything a man who had been trained to survive could offer, which was not always pretty, but was always real. Nora had been gone 14 months, and tonight Warren Holt had just thrown Caleb and his children into the snow. The storm came down hard across the Flathead Valley, the kind of January weather that Montana produces without apology. Snow hammered the peaks and poured into the passes and settled across the roads in sheets that the wind immediately sculpted into drifts 3 feet deep. The sky had no color. It was simply weight pressing down on everything beneath it, and the iron gates of the Holt estate rose out of that weight like something from a different century, black and tall and indifferent to the cold. Caleb stood on the wrong side of them. His duffel bag was on the ground at his feet. His children's suitcases were beside it, a pink one and a blue one, both too small for everything that mattered. Someone had brought the bags out before the conversation even started, which told him everything he needed to know about how the evening had been planned. On top of Lily's suitcase sat a framed photograph of Nora. The glass cracked clean across her face. The frame twisted where it had landed wrong on the stone steps. Caleb did not look at it. He had learned in the field that looking at the things that hurt you gave them more power than they deserved. Ranger stood pressed against Caleb's left leg, low and still, the way the dog positioned himself when threat was close and unresolved. His ears were flat and forward, pointing directly at the 2 men standing inside the gate. His chest produced a sound so low it was more vibration than noise. The men did not move closer. Behind Caleb, Lily had buried her face in the side of his coat, her fingers twisted in the fabric at his waist. She was 9 years old and she did not make a sound, which was worse than crying. Owen stood at Caleb's right, 7 years old, jaw set in an imitation of the expression he had seen on his father's face in photographs from before the war. His right hand gripped the brim of his wool hat so tightly the color had left his knuckles. Warren Holt stepped forward from the entrance of the main house, unhurried, crossing the stone pathway, with the ease of a man who had never needed to rush because the world had always waited for him. He was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair swept back from a face that had never been touched by weather or labor or want. His coat was cashmere. His shoes were clean. His hands, when they clasped together in front of him, were the hands of a man who had spent his life holding pens and never once a shovel. He stopped at the gate. He did not open it. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at an invoice he considers inflated. "This arrangement was always temporary," Warren said. His voice was level and even, the practiced calm of a lawyer who had spent decades making certain that nothing he said in a difficult conversation could be used against him. "I was generous in extending it as long as I did. Your permission to remain in this house ended the moment the estate review began." Caleb looked at him. He did not speak yet. "You are not family, Caleb," Warren continued. "You were Nora's husband. Nora is gone, and the decisions that need to be made about this family's future are no longer ones you have standing to participate in." Ranger's growl deepened by 1 register. The 2 men inside the gate shifted their weight back. Caleb kept his voice quiet. He had learned that quiet was more difficult to dismiss than volume. Nora would not have wanted this. Warren's expression did not change. It did not need to. "Nora is gone," he said again. "What she would have wanted no longer applies." The gate did not swing open. It had never needed to. There was nothing on the other side of it for Caleb anymore. He bent down and picked up both suitcases. He placed his free hand on Lily's shoulder, and then on Owen's one, and then the other, taking a single breath and letting himself feel their weight, their warmth, the trembling. They were both too brave to name. He grounded himself in them, the way Ranger grounded himself in the ground beneath his paws. Steady, present, still here. He walked to the truck without looking back. He got the children in. He put the bags in the bed. He opened the rear door, and Ranger jumped in and immediately turned twice and settled with his head between the front seats, his eyes finding Caleb's in the rearview mirror. The engine turned over on the third try. Caleb pulled out onto the county road and drove into the storm. For a while, no one spoke. Snow reduced visibility to 30 feet, and Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, watching the edges of the road where the snowpack told him where the asphalt ended and the shoulder began. The heater ran loud and pushed warm air that smelled of dust and old rubber. Ranger rested his chin on the center console. From the back seat, Lily's voice came small and careful. "Dad, is this because of Mom?" Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "We're going somewhere safe," he said. "We're north of Whitefish, your Grandpa Jim's old place." Owen shifted in his seat. "The one that's been empty, it's still standing." That was true as far as it went. The farmhouse where Jim and Ruth Merritt had raised Caleb through the second half of his childhood had been sitting empty for 3 years since Ruth had gone first, and Jim had followed her 6 months later, as men who have spent 40 years next to the same person often do. Caleb had not been back since the funeral. He had not let himself think about whether the roof still held, or the pipes still ran, or the floorboards had finally surrendered to the seasons they had resisted for 60 years. He thought about Nora instead. It happened the way it would always happen, the way grief found its way in through whatever small opening existed in the moment. The truck's defroster pushed condensation off the inside of the windshield in thin, wavering lines, and the memory arrived without warning, without courtesy. Nora standing in front of their old car on a January morning, very much like this one, drawing patterns in the fog on the glass, with her fingertip laughing at something she had made that he couldn't quite see from inside the car. The particular sound of her laugh, the way it always started in her nose. He blinked. The road was still there. The storm was still there. His children were still behind him. He drove. The farmhouse was worse than he had imagined, which was saying something, because he had not imagined it charitably. The access road from the county highway had drifted over completely, and he had to push through in four-wheel drive, the truck shuddering over frozen ruts and buried rocks, until the shape of the building resolved out of the dark and the snow. The porch roof sagged at an angle that suggested the middle support had given way sometime in the past winter. One of the front windows was cracked from corner to corner, and someone some previous season had covered it from inside with a strip of yellowed tape that had since peeled back from one end. The door unlocked with the key Jim had always kept under the third flagstone from the left, which was the kind of hiding spot that only works because no one believes anyone would still do it. Inside, the air was cold and still, and carried a smell like old wood and something sweeter underneath damp and mineral, the scent of a building that has been slowly returning to the earth it was made from. Caleb stood in the entryway with his flashlight moving across the room. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had grayed with dust. The wood stove in the corner of the main room had not been used in 3 years, but appeared intact. The chimney cap would need to be checked before they lit it. Ranger moved past him and began a systematic inspection of the house room by room, his nose at floor level, pausing at thresholds, working corners. This was how the dog operated in any new environment. It was the same process he had run through bombed-out buildings in places the names of which Caleb did not say aloud anymore. Ranger trusted process. Process had kept them both alive. Caleb got the children settled in the main room with their sleeping bags and a battery lantern, while he cleared the chimney and got the wood stove running. It took 20 minutes and produced a fire that was more smoke than heat, at first then settled into something real, casting orange light across the dust sheets and the low ceiling and the faces of his children watching it. Ranger finished his circuit of the house and returned to the main room. He did not settle. He crossed to the far side of the room to the corner, near the base of the old stone fireplace, and stopped at a section of the floor where 3 boards ran together at an angle, slightly warped, raised perhaps a quarter-inch above the boards on either side. He lowered his nose to the gap between them. He made a sound in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine, but something in between. Then he looked back at Caleb. Caleb watched him for a moment. The dog's posture was specific in a way that Caleb had learned to read over 4 years of working together. This was not curiosity. This was not the restless energy of a new place. This was alertness directed at something particular. "Easy," Caleb said. "We'll look at it in the morning." Ranger held his position for 3 more seconds, then walked in a tight circle and lay down facing the boards, his chin on his paws, his eyes open. Lily stood at the door of the main room in her coat and hat, looking at the space around her with the particular expression children use when they are deciding how they feel about something. She took a long moment. "Mom would have fixed this place up," she said finally. Caleb crouched down to her eye level. "Your mom would have loved that we're together." Lily considered this. She nodded once, a small and private acceptance. Then she came and sat down next to Owen near the stove. Caleb set up the sleeping bags closer to the fire and got both children into them. He heated water on the camp stove he kept in the truck and made instant cocoa and listened to them talk about which floorboard had the loudest creak and which corner of the room Ranger seemed most suspicious of. Owen fell asleep mid-sentence. Lily lasted another 10 minutes. Caleb sat in the old chair by the stove and watched the fire and did not sleep. Across the room, Ranger had not moved from his position near the warped floorboards. Long after the lantern had been clicked off and the fire had settled to a low, steady pulse, and both children were breathing deep and even, the dog sat upright, watching the boards in the dark, waiting for something that had not announced itself yet. Caleb saw this and noted it and said nothing. He lay back and closed his eyes and saw the iron gates of the Holt estate and heard the click of the lock and felt the cold that had waited on the other side. Morning brought gray light and temperatures that had dropped another 8 degrees overnight. Caleb was up before the children, checking the perimeter of the property. The way he always checked perimeters, not from anxiety, but from habit so deep it had become indistinguishable from instinct. He walked the fence line in boots that needed waterproofing. He checked the barn. He counted the outbuildings and noted which ones were structurally sound and which were leaning in directions that had suggested they had made their peace with gravity. Ranger ranged ahead of him, moving in wide arcs, nose cycling through layers of information that Caleb could only guess at. It was near the edge of the north pasture that Caleb first saw it, a shape at the tree line, dark, vertical, human-sized present, not moving the way things at the tree line moved, not swaying with the wind that bent everything else. He looked directly at it, and it was gone. He looked at the space to the left of it, and in his peripheral vision, the shape returned. He filed it. He did not mention it to the children when they woke up. Over the next 2 days, the details accumulated in the specific way that Caleb had been trained to recognize the way that individual data points stopped from being coincidence and started being pattern. On the second afternoon coming back from town with food and fuel, he saw the SUV, black late model, parked behind a stand of brush on the service road that ran parallel to the county highway. No headlights, no exhaust vapor. Someone had let the engine cool before parking, which meant they had been there long enough to plan for not being noticed. He drove past without slowing. He caught the logo on the rear tire in the rearview mirror. Continental, a specific tread pattern he had not seen on civilian trucks in this part of the valley. He filed it. Ranger had barked once at the SUV as they passed a single sharp sound, and then gone quiet when Caleb said his name. On the third morning, Caleb found the footprints around the barn. Human. Work boots 12 inches, right foot slightly more weighted than the left from the depth of the impression. The trail led from the east side of the property, circled the barn at a distance of about 30 feet, and then disappeared into the trees to the north. Less than 24 hours old. The storm had not yet smoothed the edges. He stood over the prints for a moment and breathed cold air and thought about the geometry of a situation in which someone was watching this property and thought they were doing so without being watched. He was wrong about which of them was invisible. That afternoon, Owen came to find him where he was working on the porch railing. "Dad," Owen said, "there was a text on Lily's old phone. It was from Mr. Holt." Caleb set down the hammer. "What did it say?" Owen's jaw was set in that way again, the expression borrowed from photographs. "He said the estate review found problems. He said you should cooperate. He said it would be better for everyone." Caleb looked at his son. He put his hand on the back of the boy's neck, light and steady. "Go inside," he said. "Don't worry about it." Owen nodded and went. Caleb stood on the porch and looked north toward the tree line and thought about the word cooperate, which Warren had chosen because it suggested that non-cooperation was an available option, when in fact the conversation had already begun without Caleb's consent. He was still standing there when the nail gun at the construction site on the far edge of town fired a series of shots that crossed the distance in the cold air with a clarity that the warm months would have muffled. The sound hit him before his mind could intercept it. The porch went away. The railing under his hands went away. The cold air went away and something hotter and drier replaced it. Sand. The particular smell of sun-scorched concrete and something burning underneath. A door that had been blown off its frame at an angle that meant the corridor beyond it was wrong, was a killing ground, was somewhere that no one who entered would exit unchanged. Someone was shouting his name. The name was wrong. The voice was wrong. Everything was wrong by 3 seconds, which was how far ahead the past had gotten on the present. Then Ranger was there. The dog hit him at chest level, 104 pounds of German Shepherd, moving at speed, the impact controlled and deliberate. Front paws on Caleb's sternum, weight forward and pressing. The dog's head dropped below Caleb's chin, and Caleb felt the heat through the coat, the solidity of an animal that was completely unambiguously here and now and present. He grabbed the fur at Ranger's shoulders. Dust. Heat. A door at the wrong angle. He was still there. He breathed. Ranger did not move. He breathed again. The porch came back. The railing came back. Montana came back gray and cold, and specific the exact temperature of a January afternoon in the Flathead Valley. The nail gun had gone quiet. Caleb's right hand was shaking. He held it still against Ranger's neck and breathed until it stopped. "I'm okay," he said. The words were not quite accurate, but they were more accurate than they had been 30 seconds ago, and that was the direction that mattered. Ranger stepped back and sat and watched him. Not the expression of a mouse that has done something extraordinary, the expression of a queen for whom the extraordinary has become ordinary and who finds that perfectly acceptable. Caleb's hands steadied over the next 2 minutes. He went inside and checked on the children and then stood at the kitchen window and watched the tree line and thought with the clarity that the episode always left in its wake, a cold and narrow clarity, like water after the mud has settled. They wanted him afraid. They wanted him reactive. They wanted him behaving in ways that a family court judge would call unstable. He was not going to give them that. He would give them something else entirely. The third night was the worst the storm had produced. Wind came down from the Canadian border and hit the valley like something that had been building speed for 1,000 miles, which it had. The farmhouse shuddered at its frame. The fire in the wood stove worked hard and barely held ground. The temperature inside dropped to 51 degrees, and Caleb moved both sleeping bags closer to the stove and added a third layer to each child and sat in the chair with Ranger at his feet and listened to the building negotiate with the weather. The first sound came at 11:40, a single impact against the north wall. Not the wind was continuous. This was a strike deliberate and sharp, and then nothing after it. Ranger was on his feet before the echo faded, head low, body rigid, eyes moving to the wall and then to Caleb and back. Caleb stood and checked the north window. Nothing visible through the snow and dark. He sat back down. The second sound came 14 minutes later, a scrape long and slow moving along the east siding from back to front, like something being drawn deliberately across the boards, like someone making sure it was heard inside. Lily's eyes opened. She looked at Caleb. He shook his head, a small and steady motion. She closed her eyes again. Ranger moved to the east wall and stood with his nose an inch from the boards. The third sound was at the front door. 3 knocks. Solid. Unhurried. The knock of a person who is not worried about the answer. Caleb crossed the room and opened the door. No one there. Snow, wind, the dark shape of the truck. Boot prints in the new snow on the porch, 2 sets going toward the door from the right side, 2 sets retreating to the left. Whoever it was had circled the porch rather than approached directly. They wanted him awake. They wanted him checked. They wanted him to know the night was not his alone. He shut the door. He turned back into the room. The sound that followed was not a knock or a scrape or a strike from outside. It came from inside, from the corner, near the stone fireplace, from the 3 warped boards that Ranger had been watching since their first night. A crack, then a deep structural groan. Then the boards gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and the floor opened and something dropped into the dark below. Lily screamed. Owen scrambled backward until he hit the wall. Ranger lunged forward and stopped at the edge of the hole, every muscle rigid, staring down. Caleb crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched at the edge and shone his flashlight into the gap. Beneath the floor, in a space that the farmhouse had apparently been keeping secret for longer than Caleb had been alive, Something glinted. He reached down. His fingers closed on a handle metal, cold rigid. He pulled. What came up was a box approximately 18 inches long and 12 wide, black metal, reinforced at every corner with steel banding. The fasteners were a design he recognized from a very specific context. He had handled boxes with identical hardware, overseas boxes that were used to transport materials that required protection from moisture and heat and impact in time. This box had been made to last. He held it in both hands and felt its weight and felt something shift in him that he did not have a name for yet. Not hope, not fear, something older than both. The feeling of a door you have not approached before and cannot yet see beyond. Ranger sat at his side and did not take his eyes from the box. Owen's voice came from the wall, small but steady. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Caleb said. That was almost true. He set the box on the cleared surface of the old dinner table and stood over it while his children came slowly to either side of him, and while Ranger positioned himself at the corner of the table with the particular authority of a dog who has led you somewhere and is now waiting to see if you understand why. The fasteners opened with a sound like small locks releasing. Each one turned smooth and clean, the mechanism still precise after however many years it had been sitting under that floor, which told him something about the quality of what had been built and something about the care of whoever had built it. He lifted the lid. The shawl was on top. Blue-gray wool, the color of water under cloud cover, soft even through the cold and the years. Caleb's hand found it before his mind caught up to what he was seeing. He had seen this shawl on Nora's shoulders on more winter mornings than he could count. She had worn it reading in the chair by the window in the apartment in Billings. She had worn it the last autumn she was well enough to sit outside. He had not seen it since. He did not pick it up. He held his fingers against the wool for a moment and breathed. Beneath the shawl, a sealed envelope. His name on the front in Nora's handwriting, the particular way she formed the C in Caleb always slightly larger than necessary, as if the letter deserved the space. Beneath the envelope, a USB drive sealed in a protective case with a strip of tape across the latch and 2 words written on the tape in blue ink. 2 words in Nora's hand. He read them. He set the case aside. Beneath the drive, papers folded with signatures he did not recognize, and a letterhead he could not read in the light of the single flashlight. Beneath the papers, a business card, white simple, black text, Samuel Pierce, Estate Law, Missoula, Montana. And at the very bottom, in the corner of the box, nested against the metal edge, as if placed there separately from everything else, a small object he almost missed. A bracelet, silver-thin size for a child's wrist. He recognized it in the way you recognize something that has been part of you so long you have stopped seeing it as separate from yourself. He had worn this bracelet until he was 11 years old. He had found it on his own wrist when Jim and Ruth Merritt first brought him home, along with a coat that wasn't his, and a name that no one had been able to confirm. Ruth had said it looked like something a family would put on a child to make sure the child could be identified. She had kept it in a box on the dresser for years. He had not thought about it in 20 years. He turned it over in his fingers. On the inside of the band, a hallmark, and below the hallmark letters, tiny hand engraved, EMH. He set it down on this table and picked up the envelope and opened it and unfolded the single page inside. Nora's handwriting. He read. The letter was short, half a page written in the compressed, efficient prose of someone who knew they were running low on the time required for elaboration. If you are reading this, it means Warren has already moved and what I was afraid of has already begun. I have known for 2 years that he would do this the moment he had the opportunity. My uncle has been controlling a trust that was never his to control money that was left for you and for our children, and he has spent 11 years keeping that from happening. I could not fight him while I was sick. I was afraid of what he would do if I tried, so I did what I could. I found the right lawyer. I built the record. I hid what needed hiding until the time came to use it. Go to Samuel Pierce in Missoula. He has been waiting for you. Do not go to any other lawyer first. Do not speak to Warren's attorneys under any circumstances. Do not wait longer than you have to. The USB drive in this box is not to be opened until you are with Pierce. Those are his instructions and mine both. Protect Lily and Owen. They are why I built all of this. You are why I believed it would work. Trust Ranger. He knew where this box was before I put it here. I don't know how to explain that, so I'm not going to try. I love you. I have loved you since the first night I saw you standing in the cold outside that bar in Billings, looking like a man who had survived something enormous and wasn't sure what to do with the surviving. I knew then. I know now. Go. Don't wait. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. The fire in the wood stove moved steadily behind the grate. Wind pushed at the roof. Lily's voice was quiet and certain. She knew. She planned all of this, didn't she? Owen was looking at the bracelet on the table. How long did she know? Caleb had no answer for the second question. He was not sure anyone did. Ranger came around the table and sat at Caleb's feet and placed one paw on top of Caleb's boot and did not move it. Caleb looked at the USB case still sitting in the box, the strip of tape across the latch, the two words Nora had written on it in blue ink. Not yet. He picked the case up and held it. Two words. A door she had left locked until the right room. In the box beneath where the case had been, there was a second USB drive. Also sealed. Also in a protective case. Also with a strip of tape. But the words on this one were different. Open only with Pierce. Not before. He set both cases back in the box and closed the lid. Outside, the storm was doing what Montana storms do when they have decided to make a point. The wind pulled at the corners of the farmhouse and found no give, and the snow came down in sheets that the flashlight beam turned to static, and somewhere in the trees to the north, a branch snapped under weight and fell. Ranger's head lifted. His ears moved forward, precise and independent. Whatever was out there in the dark, he was already listening for it. Samuel Pierce's office was on the third floor of a building on Higgins Avenue in Missoula that had been constructed in 1923 and had not been significantly altered since, which suited the man inside it. The waiting room had dark wood paneling and brass fixtures and the kind of silence that accumulates over decades of people sitting in it with difficult problems. A receptionist in her 60s directed Caleb and the children to chairs and offered them water, and looked at Ranger with the measured assessment of a woman who had seen many things come through that door and had learned not to be surprised by any of them. Pierce himself appeared 7 minutes later. He was 62 years old, built lean and angular, with close-cropped, silver hair, and the kind of face that had settled into its final form sometime in middle age and stopped negotiating. He wore a gray suit that was neither expensive nor cheap, only correct for the work it was meant to do. His handshake was brief and firm, and he looked at Caleb with the particular attention of a man who has been expecting someone for a long time and is now assessing whether the person who arrived matches what he had been told to expect. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "I'm glad you came." He looked at the children. He looked at Ranger. Something in his expression shifted by a degree that Caleb would have missed if he hadn't spent 15 years reading faces under circumstances where the reading mattered. "Come in," Pierce said, "all of you." His office was orderly in the way that working offices are when the person using them knows exactly where everything is and has no interest in performing organization for the benefit of visitors. Files stacked with precision. A single-frame photograph on the desk turned away from visitors. 3 chairs positioned in front of the desk, which told Caleb that Pierce had known who was coming. Pierce settled behind the desk and folded his hands and looked at Caleb. "The lockbox," he said. "You found it." 3 days ago, Caleb said. "The dog found it." Pierce nodded as if this were information he had expected. "Your wife told me he would." He paused. "She told me a great many things over the course of 2 years. I want you to understand that everything she did methodically and with complete legal soundness. Whatever Warren Holt has told you or led you to believe about the state of the estate, I want you to hear the actual situation from me directly." He opened a file. "The Holt Family Trust," he said, "was established in 1987 by Eleanor Margaret Holt, your wife's maternal grandmother. Eleanor was a woman of considerable independent wealth, which is a fact that Warren Holt spent considerable energy obscuring because Eleanor's money came entirely from her side of the family and had nothing to do with the business interests Warren controlled after his father died." Caleb listened. Beside him, Lily had taken Owen's hand without appearing to notice she had done it. "Eleanor established the trust with a single activation condition," Pierce continued. "The trust would transfer in full to Nora's direct family upon Nora's marriage and the establishment of her household. It was designed specifically to bypass Warren's line of inheritance. Eleanor did not trust her nephew. She had reasons. How much? Caleb said. Pierce looked at him steadily. The trust has been growing since 1987, he said. Nora's grandmother was a precise woman. He said the number. $180 million. The room held the number for a moment. The heater in the baseboard ran. Snow moved against the window. Ranger shifted his weight and leaned against Caleb's leg. Owen said nothing. Lily's grip on her brother's hand tightened. Caleb sat very still. He had learned in the field that the moments after an unexpected development were the moments most likely to produce bad decisions, and the correct response to them was stillness and breath. That's not possible, he said finally. Nora never lived like someone with that kind of money. She didn't want to, Pierce said. She wanted to protect it, and she wanted to make sure Warren could never touch it. Then why didn't she tell me? Pierce looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. Because she was 6, he said, and she was afraid that if Warren knew she had found the documentation, he would move before she had finished building the record. She needed time. She asked me if she had enough of it. He paused. I told her to work as quickly as she could. Caleb absorbed this. Nora in the last year, Nora with the laptop at the kitchen table while he thought she was resting. Nora on the phone, her voice dropping when he came into the room, which he had attributed to the illness and the privacy that illness sometimes required. Nora building something in the time she had left, piece by piece, the way a person builds anything when they know the building has to outlast them. The activation clause, Pierce said. This is important. Eleanor designed the trust to include specific protections. If any member of the Holt family attempted to interfere with Nora's household, to coerce, manipulate, or take legal action against her family in bad faith, those actions would constitute automatic grounds for trust activation and Warren's exclusion from any claim on the estate. He let this settle. Warren thrust you out of the house, Pierce said. He filed a fraudulent custody challenge based on fabricated psychological assessments. He ordered surveillance on this property. He set 3 photographs on the desk. My investigator documented the vehicle and 2 of the men. Caleb looked at the photographs, a black SUV, Continental tires, the specific tread pattern he had noted on the county road. He has activated every trigger Eleanor wrote into that trust, Pierce said. Precisely as your wife predicted he would. She knew how he operated. She spent 2 years making sure that when he did, there would be a record of all of it. He closed the folder. Mr. Merritt, there is one more thing. He reached into the desk drawer and produced a single sheet aged at the edges. The paper thickened slightly by time. He placed it face up on the desk. It was a photograph, black and white, a family group, a man, a woman, and a child of perhaps 4 years old. The man looked directly at the camera with an expression that Caleb had seen before, not in photographs, but in mirrors. Eleanor Holt had one son, Pierce said carefully. His name was James Allen Holt. In the winter of 1986, James and his wife were traveling through the Flathead Valley with their young son. There was an accident, a road outside Whitefish. He paused. James and his wife did not survive. Caleb looked at the photograph. The child was never recovered, Pierce said. There was a search. It went on for weeks. Eleanor never accepted that he was gone. She kept a file on it until she died. He looked at Caleb with the directness of a man who has decided that the most merciful thing he can do is be clear. The bracelet you found in the lockbox. Eleanor cataloged it in her records in 1987. She wrote that it was the bracelet she had clasped onto her grandson's wrist herself the morning of the day they left. The room was very quiet. Lily's voice came from somewhere that sounded far away. Dad, Caleb set the photograph down on the desk. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The man in it was not him. The man in it was a stranger. The man in it had his brown in his eyes and the particular set of his shoulders that Nora had always called the Navy posture, even when he was wearing civilian clothes. What he said. The word came out before the sentence was ready. We believe Pierce said that you are James Holt's son, which would make you Eleanor's grandson, which would mean the trust was never Warren's to manage in the first place by any reading of Eleanor's documents. It belonged to your family twice over. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his hands on the frame and looked down at Higgins Avenue and the snow coming down onto the parked cars and the people on the sidewalks moving with the particular purpose of people who were cold and headed somewhere warm. Behind him, Ranger crossed the room and sat at his side. Caleb heard Pierce say something to the children, something gentle and redirecting, asking Owen if he liked hot chocolate and signaling to the receptionist through some system Caleb didn't track. He stood at the window and looked at the street. He had been found in the snow. He had been 3 years old. Jim and Ruth Merritt had driven him to the hospital and held his hand and named him from the Bible and raised him in a small house north of Whitefish, with patience and consistency and the complete absence of drama, which was itself a form of love that he had not fully understood until he had spent 15 years in environments that had none of it. He had never known where he had come from. Now he was standing in a lawyer's office in Missoula, and the answer had been waiting for him in a box under a farmhouse floor in the same valley where he had been found 35 years ago. He turned back from the window. "The man outside in the black SUV," he said. Pierce looked up. He crossed to the window and looked down. The SUV was parked across the street, engine off position with a view of the building entrance. "That's not one of mine," Pierce said. Caleb picked up the lockbox from the floor beside his chair. He checked that both USB cases were secure inside. He looked at his children, who were watching him with the particular calibration that children develop when they have been living in uncertain situations long enough to read their parents' face for information. "Pierce," he said, "how fast can you move?" "I've been ready to move for 14 months, Pierce said. "I was waiting for you." They left through the building's rear entrance. The farmhouse felt different when they returned to it that evening. Not safer, more charged. As if the air inside had changed composition while they were sawn in, as if the walls had absorbed the weight of what the day had contained and were still deciding what to do with it. Caleb put the children to bed early and sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox open in front of him and thought about geometry. Warren knew about Pierce now, or would soon. The surveillance on Pierce's building meant the meeting had been observed. The next move would come faster than Caleb had been planning, for which meant he needed to compress his own timeline. He was still at the table at midnight when the lights went out. Not gradually the way power sometimes fails in a storm. All at once, the single bulb above the table, the digital clock on the old microwave, the amber indicator on the wood stove's thermostat. Everything gone in an instant, replaced by the total dark of a rural property in the middle of a Montana January. Ranger was at the back door before the darkness had settled. Caleb was right behind him. He opened the back door and stood in the frame and listened. Wind, snow, the creek 30 yards east, audible even in winter. And beneath it a sound he should not have been able to hear at this distance, but could because he had spent enough hours in enough dark places learning to hear things that preferred not to be heard. Footsteps in snow, moving away from the property toward the road. He got the flashlight and went to the power box on the side of the house. The lines that ran from the pole to the meter had been cut. Not wind damage, not a fallen branch. A clean cut at shoulder height, the kind made with a long-handled tool in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it done cleanly. He photographed it with his phone. He went back inside and blocked the door and added wood to the stove. He did not sleep. The sheriff's vehicle arrived at 10 the next morning. Caleb watched it come up the access road from the kitchen window. Sheriff Ray Denton was a compact man in his early 50s with a face shaped by 25 Montana winters and the specific wariness of a man who has spent his career mediating between people who want him to take sides. He came alone. He did not have his hand near his belt. These were good signs. He stood on the porch and delivered the news the way a man delivers news he has not chosen to carry. "Warren Holt filed for emergency custody," Denton said. "Filed yesterday afternoon. Judge signed a temporary order this morning." He looked somewhere past Caleb's shoulder. "He's claiming psychological instability, claiming a pattern of erratic behavior following your wife's death." Caleb waited. "There's also a complaint about the dog," Denton said. "Claims it's a danger to the children." He shifted his weight. He looked at the cut power lines along the side of the house, which were visible from the porch if you knew to look. "I'm going to be honest with you," Denton said. "The men who cut those lines last night." He paused. "I found the tire tracks on the service road. Continental tread unusual pattern. Those weren't kids. Those weren't locals." "No," Caleb said. "They weren't." Denton looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't know what's happening here fully, but I know what I can see, and what I can see is a man with 2 kids living in a house with no power in January, and someone cutting his lines in the middle of the night." He put his hat back on. "You might want to move faster than you're planning." He went back to his vehicle. Caleb watched him go and stood on the porch and felt the cold and thought about the word faster, which Denton had used in the same way Pierce had used ready, which was the way people use those words when they were trying to tell you something that the official context of the conversation did not allow them to say directly. Owen appeared in the doorway behind him. "Dad," he said, "can he actually take us?" Caleb turned and looked at his son, 7 years old, standing in the doorway of a farmhouse without power in a Montana January, asking a man who had survived things he would never describe whether the thing currently threatening them was survivable. "Not while I'm breathing," Caleb said. He said it quietly. He said it the way he said things that he intended to be true. Owen nodded and went back inside. Caleb stood for another moment on the porch. The wind moved through the pines along the north fence. The tree line was still and visible in the clear morning air. The tremor started in his hands first. It moved up his forearms in a wave that he recognized the way you recognize the early signs of weather, not with surprise, but with the specific acknowledgement of something you knew was coming. His vision narrowed at the edges. His breathing went shallow in the way it went shallow when the body decided the chest needed to be smaller, needed to be less visible, needed to take up less space in the world. He gripped the porch railing, wood under his palms, cold specific real, the grain of it running left to right under his fingers. This particular temperature, this particular surface, not sand, not concrete, not a corridor leading to something irreversible. Ranger pressed against his legs from the left side, the full weight of him leaning in a warm and solid fact. Caleb breathed, the railing, cold grain running left to right. Montana, January, his children inside. He breathed again. "I'm here," he said. The word he usually said was okay. He was not sure when that had changed, only that it had changed and that here was more accurate. Here was what he could verify. Here was what the weight of the bar against his legs and the grain of the wood under his palms was telling him. The tremor passed in 4 breaths. His vision returned to its full width. He stood up straight. He went inside to his children. Warren arrived that afternoon. He came alone, which was the first thing Caleb noticed as the car appeared at the end of the access road. No convoy, no deputies. Just a dark sedan moving slowly up the ruts, parking on the near side of the gate, and Warren Holt stepping out into the gray afternoon light in a coat that had not been designed for the kind of cold that had settled into the valley. He did not come through the gate. He stood at the property line, which was either a legal calculation or an instinct, and Caleb thought probably both. There was a man with him, a lawyer from the look of the briefcase and the way he positioned himself half a step behind Warren and to the left. Caleb stepped off the porch and walked to the gate and stopped on his side of it. They looked at each other across 6 feet of frozen ground. Warren had aged in the days since the expulsion, or perhaps Caleb was seeing him now without the architecture of the Holt estate behind him, without the gate and the stone and the staff, which had made him look like a feature of a landscape rather than a man standing in it. He looked older. He looked colder in the non-weather sense. "I'm giving you an opportunity," Warren said. He was still controlling his voice, still running it through the professional filter, but there was something different in it now, a pressure behind it that had not been visible before. "Sign the children into temporary guardianship. My lawyers will draft a financial arrangement that's genuinely generous. You'll have resources to establish yourself wherever you want." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Get off this property," he said. "You're not understanding the position you're in." "I understand it completely." Caleb kept his voice even. "You filed a fraudulent custody challenge using fabricated assessments. You cut my power lines. You've had 2 men watching this property since before we arrived, and you're standing on the edge of my land offering me money to disappear." He paused. "I know exactly what position I'm in." Warren's expression held. He was a man who had spent decades in rooms where the other person blinked first, and he had learned to wait. "Nora chose this path," Warren said. "Whatever she told you about the trust, whatever that lawyer in Missoula is selling you, it's built on documents that won't survive a real examination. I've been managing that estate for 11 years. I know every line of every file." "I know you do," Caleb said. "That's the problem." Something moved in Warren's face. A small thing contained quickly, but there. The first crack in the surface hairline and sealed over before it could be read. This can still be quiet, Warren said. It won't be, Caleb said. But that's a choice you made, not me. Warren looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at Ranger, who had come to stand at Caleb's left side in the same position he took in every standoff, weight distributed, ears forward, eyes on the threat. Warren turned back to his car. This isn't over, he said. Caleb said nothing. He watched Warren's car reverse down the access road and turn onto the county highway and disappear toward Kalispell. He stood at the gate until the sound of the engine faded. He should have felt something more than what he felt, which was not satisfaction, not relief, but a cold and specific clarity. The kind that settles in after a long period of uncertainty, resolves into something you can name. Warren was not going to stop. Warren was going to escalate. The conversation that had just happened was not a step toward resolution. It was Warren recalibrating, returning to Kalispell to make new plans with new urgency, because whatever he had expected when he drove out here, it had not been a man who looked at him the way Caleb had just looked at him. Caleb went inside. He made dinner. He helped Owen with the math homework that had been set aside in the chaos of the past week. He watched Lily read in the orange light of the wood stove. He waited. At 2 in the morning, when both children were deeply asleep and the farmhouse had settled into the particular stillness of deep night, Ranger rose from his position near the stove. Caleb was awake. He had not slept. He watched the dog. Ranger did not go to the front door. He did not go to the windows. He walked with the careful deliberateness that Caleb associated with operating on certainty rather than suspicion, the walk of an animal who knows where it is going before it gets there. Ranger went to the barn door. He looked back once at Caleb. Caleb put on his boots and his coat and followed. The barn was 30 yards from the house across open ground, and the cold hit him in the face like something thrown. He moved in the flashlight beam, with Ranger ahead of him, the dog's breath visible in small clouds, his pace steady and unhurried. Inside the barn, the air was degrees warmer than outside and smelled of old hay and metal, and the specific mineral smell that old wood produces when it has been sealed against weather for a long time. The beam swept across the stalls, the workbench, the row of old tools along the east wall, the rusted collection of equipment that Jim Merritt had accumulated over 40 years of farming and never discarded. Ranger went to the north wall. The wall was fieldstone to a height of 4 feet, and board and batten above that, the boards weathered gray, the batten slightly darker where the moisture came off the stones below in spring. Ranger moved along the base of the stone with his nose at the junction of stone and dirt floor, then stopped at a section where 3 stones were set slightly differently from the others, their faces flush to the wall but their edges mortared with something that had a different color than the surrounding joints. He sat. He looked at Caleb. Caleb crouched and ran his fingers along the stone. The mortar at the right edge was not mortar, it was wood cut to fit the joint and painted gray. He worked his fingers behind the rightmost stone and pulled. The 3 stones came out together, hinged on the left side, a panel that swung inward to reveal a space behind the wall that the stone face had been constructed to conceal. Inside the space, resting on a rough wooden shelf, was a second box, larger than the first. The metal surface had a different patina, older, and stamped into the lid in letters worn nearly smooth by handling were the words Eleanor M. Holt, and below them a date, 1952. Below the date, a small circular depression that matched in diameter and depth the clasp of a certain silver bracelet. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and found the bracelet where he had been carrying it since the attorney's office. He pressed the clasp into the depression. The lock disengaged with a sound like something that had been held closed for a very long time, finally deciding to let go. He lifted the lid. The contents were layered with the deliberateness of someone who had done considerable thinking about what order things should be found in. On top, a flash drive in a protective case with a strip of tape across the latch. An envelope. Beneath the envelope, photographs, black and white and color both. Beneath the photographs, a manila folder with a typed label. Below everything, a sealed tube of the kind used for document preservation, acid-free, capped at both ends. Caleb set the flash drive aside. He opened the envelope. The handwriting was not Nora's. He did not recognize it for the first moment. Then something in the formation of certain letters connected to a place in his memory that he had not visited in many years, and he understood. He was holding a letter from his wife, not from Nora. From Nora in the way that Nora had been before she was Nora Merritt, from the version of her that had existed before he knew her, from the person she had been when she was carrying things she had not yet told anyone. He understood this in the way you understand certain things not through reasoning, but through the weight of the thing in your hands. He read. She had written it 2 years before she died. The money is real and the documents are real, and by the time you find this box, you will already know both of those things. So I'm not going to spend the time on that. What I want to spend this letter on is harder. I have known who you were for longer than I have admitted to anyone. I didn't find out by accident. I was looking because something about the way you described growing up in the Flathead Valley, the way you described being found in the snow, and having no name when Jim and Ruth brought you in, something kept pulling at me until I spent 3 months going through county records and hospital archives and Eleanor's private correspondence, which she had deposited with a historical preservation organization in Missoula, without knowing what she was giving them. I found the records. I found the DNA her family had submitted during the original search. I had a test run without telling you, which is the single dishonest thing I have done in our marriage, and I have asked myself every day since whether it was the right call. I think it was. Because if I had told you, you would have spent the time we had left focused on that, and I wanted you focused on us, on Lily, on Owen, on the specific and unrepeatable days of the life we were still living. You are Eleanor Holt's grandson, James and Miriam Holt's son. The accident happened on the county road outside Whitefish on February 3rd, 1986. You were 3 years old. The search teams found the vehicle. They searched for 18 days. They never found you. They looked. I need you to know that. They looked until there was nothing left to look with. Eleanor paid for additional searches for 2 years. She never stopped believing you were out there. I married into the family that lost you, and then I found you. I have turned that fact over in my mind so many times that I no longer know what shape it is. What I know is this Warren has controlled a trust that was always yours. He knew about the DNA records. He suppressed them. He has known for at least 8 years who you are and chosen to say nothing because saying something would mean giving back what he has been keeping. The documents in this box will prove it. I could not fight him while I was sick. I was afraid of what he would do to you and the children if I moved too early. So I did what I could do from where I was. I built the record, and I hid the pieces, and I trusted that you would find them because you were always the person who found things that other people had given up on. I have loved you since the beginning. I don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound small relative to what it actually is, so I'll say it simply. You have always been enough, not what you serve out, not what you carried, you, exactly as you are. I'm sorry I ran out of time to say this to your face. I practiced it. I had specific plans for how I would sit you down and tell you all of it and watch your expression move through the 17 phases it goes through when you're processing something large. I am sorry I don't get to see that. Take care of our children. Let Pierce do his job. Trust Ranger. I mean, that literally he has found things in that farmhouse that I put there, and 2 things that I didn't, and I have no explanation for either. I love you. I have loved you every day since the beginning, and I will love you in whatever form love takes after this. Don't be afraid of what the documents say. You were always supposed to be here. Caleb sat on the ground of the barn for a long time. He did not know how long. He was aware of the cold at some remove, the way you are aware of conditions that the body is registering, but the mind has decided to table for later. Ranger lay beside him with his head on Caleb's leg, motionless and warm and present. At some point, Caleb became aware that he was not alone in the barn. He looked up. Lily and Owen stood at the barn door in their coats over their pajamas, barefoot, in their boots, faces pale from the cold and from having been woken by something they couldn't name. They had come out without calling for him, which meant they had been awake and listening and had decided that what he needed was not to be called, but to be found. He held out one arm. They crossed the barn floor and came to him, one on each side, and he held them in the cold, with the letter still in his hand, and Ranger pressed against all 3 of them and the wind working at the roof of the old barn. Your mom left this for us, he said. She knew. She knew everything, and she trusted us to get through it. Lily was quiet for a moment. Did she know about you, she asked, about where you came from? Yes, he said. That's a lot to know, Lily said. He held them and looked at the box still open on the shelf and thought about a woman who had spent the last 2 years of her life in the specific labor of building a path through a darkness she was not going to be able to walk through herself, and who had trusted him to walk it anyway. The barn was very cold. He got his children back to the farmhouse and back to their sleeping bags and sat in the chair by the stove until the gray before dawn lightened the windows, not sleeping, only waiting for the next thing to begin. It began at 8:15 the following morning. Caleb saw the convoy from the kitchen window. 3 vehicles moving up the access road in single file. He recognized the lead vehicle as belonging to the county sheriff's department. The second and third were unmarked dark, the kind of vehicles that carry people who have been told to look official. He stood at the window for 3 seconds. Then he called Pierce. He said 4 words. "They're here." "How long before?" Pierce said, 20 minutes. "Don't open the door." Caleb set the phone on the table and looked at Ranger. "Stay close," he said. He stepped out onto the porch as the convoy parked in the yard. 3 deputies and 4 other men. One of the men was carrying a folder thick enough to be a statement about something. A second man had positioned himself behind the first vehicle in a way that was technically casual and actually strategic. Caleb noted this and noted the distance and noted the exits and then brought his attention fully to the sheriff, who was crossing the yard with the expression of a man who has been given instructions he would have preferred not to receive. "Mr. Merritt," Denton said, "I have a temporary custody order signed by Judge Albrecht in Kalispell. I'm required to execute it." He held out the paperwork. Caleb looked at the papers without touching them. He looked at the deputies. He looked at the 4 men behind the vehicles. "Those aren't your people," Caleb said. Denton glanced back. "Private process servers," he said. The word private had a texture in his voice. Caleb stood where he was on the porch with his hands open at his sides and said nothing. The door behind him opened. Ranger came through it at speed, not running, but moving with the controlled force of a large working dog who has assessed the situation and made a determination. He placed himself in front of Caleb between the steps and the yard, and he did not growl. He made a sound that was past growling. It was a full-throated declaration from an animal that weighed 104 pounds and had spent 4 years being trained to mean exactly what he sounded like. The 4 process servers stopped moving. The deputies did not advance. Denton stood his ground to his credit, but he had both hands visible and raised very slightly, which was the unconscious posture of a man who has decided that stillness is the better option. Into the stillness came the sound of tires on the access road, a single vehicle, moving at a pace that was not hurried but was also not cautious. It parked at the edge of the yard, and Samuel Pierce got out with a briefcase in one hand and 2 manila envelopes in the other, and he walked across the frozen ground to where the sheriff was standing with the expression of a man who has done this particular kind of walk before. "Sheriff Denton," he said. He did not look at the 4 men behind the vehicles. "Federal District Court, Missoula, issued an injunction at 6 this morning staying all state custody proceedings pending review of fraud allegations in the underlying application." He held out the first envelope. "You'll want to make sure Judge Albrecht has a copy of that." He held out the second envelope. "This is a trust protection order. It bars any member of the Holt estate management directly or through agents from taking action affecting the minor children named in the trust documents until the fraud investigation concludes." Denton took both envelopes. He looked at them. He looked at the 4 men behind the vehicles. He looked at Caleb on the porch. "I'll need to make some calls," he said. "Of course," Pierce said. The deputies conferred. The 4 men behind the vehicles had a conversation that Caleb could not hear, and then one of them made a phone call. Denton stood to one side and spoke quietly into his radio for 3 minutes. Then he came back. "I'm going to hold on executing this order pending clarification from the court," he said. He looked at Caleb. "Keep your phone on." He signaled to the deputies and they got back in their vehicle. The 4 men followed in theirs. The convoy moved back down the access road. The yard was quiet. Ranger watched until the last vehicle was gone, then he sat. Caleb stood on the porch and breathed the cold air. Pierce came to the steps and looked up at him. "We have maybe 72 hours, Pierce said. "Warren is going to move this to a friendly court if he can. We need to be in front of a federal judge before that happens." Caleb nodded. From behind him came the sound of movement, and then Owen appeared in the doorway, looking at the now empty yard and then at his father's face and then at Pierce and then back at his father. "We're fighting back now," Owen said. "We're fighting back now," Caleb said. Ranger turned his head and looked at Caleb. He barked once. It was not a question. That night, someone threw a rock through the window of the room where Lily and Owen slept. The glass came inward across the floor in a spray that woke both children instantly and brought Caleb through the door in under 3 seconds from his position in the main room. No one was hurt. The rock was a large, flat fieldstone of the kind found along creek banks in this part of the valley. No note, no message, none needed. Caleb swept the glass into the corner. He moved the children to the main room and covered the window with a doubled canvas tarp nailed at the frame. He stood in the cold dark of the damaged room and looked at the fieldstone on the floor. Warren had stopped using lawyers for this particular communication. Caleb picked up the stone and carried it to the main room and set it on the table with the lockbox and the photographs and Pierce's documents where it would remain as evidence. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the letter still folded in his coat pocket, about the word enough which Nora had used and what she had meant by it, which was not that he had reached some acceptable minimum, but that the thing he already was had been the right thing all along. He thought about the bracelet from Eleanor Holt and the records from the search that had gone on for 18 days and the woman who had paid for 2 additional years of looking and never stopped believing. He thought about what it cost to keep believing in something the evidence has given up on. He was still thinking about it when Ranger came and sat at his feet and pressed his head against Caleb's knee and held it there. The fieldstone sat on the table in the orange light of the wood stove. Caleb looked at it and felt something that was not anger exactly, but was what anger distills into after a man has had enough time and enough training to let it settle. Clarity, purpose, the specific and quiet intention of someone who has run out of the capacity to be surprised and has moved into the territory beyond surprise where decisions get made. Warren had stopped playing by rules he had already broken. That was a mistake, because Caleb had spent 15 years operating in environments where rules had already broken down, and the men who understood that terrain were never the ones who had caused the breakdown. They were the ones who knew what to do after. The federal courthouse in Missoula was a building that had absorbed a great deal of human difficulty over its years of operation, and it wore this history the way certain buildings do, in the weight of its silence, in the particular quality of the air, in its corridors, in the way voices dropped automatically when people moved from the street into its interior. The ceilings were high and the floors were polished stone, and the wooden benches in the gallery had been worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them with things they could not put down. Caleb arrived early. He wore the suit that he had last worn to Nora's funeral, which was the only suit he owned, pressed the night before with an iron borrowed from a neighbor 2 farms over. The suit was not expensive. It was clean and it was correct, and it was the suit a man wears when the occasion requires him to be present as something more than the sum of what has happened to him. Ranger walked beside him on the lead, and the bailiff who checked them in at the door looked at the dog and looked at Caleb and looked at the documentation Pierce had filed regarding Ranger's status, and then stood aside without comment. Lillian Owen sat in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table with a woman from Pierce's office who had 3 children of her own and had volunteered for this particular assignment. Lily wore the blue-gray shawl from the lockbox over her coat, which she had asked to do, and which Caleb had agreed to without explanation, understanding that she needed it the same way he had needed to carry the bracelet. Warren Holt sat across the aisle at the defense table with 2 attorneys from a firm in Kalispell and 1 from Billings who had driven through the night. All 3 of them were whispering. All 3 of them had very good suits. The suits did not appear to be helping. Warren himself sat still at the center of this activity, with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has decided that composure is the last settle he has left and intends to spend it carefully. He did not look at Caleb. The gallery held 43 people. Caleb had not expected 43 people. Some of them were press. Some of them were community members from Whitefish and the surrounding valley who had heard things through the specific network that rural communities maintain for exactly this kind of information. One of them was Sheriff Denton, sitting in the back row in civilian clothes, off-duty present on his own time. Judge Margaret Okafor entered at 9:15. She was 60 years old with close-cropped natural hair and a face that had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades listening to people at their worst and their most desperate, and has emerged from this experience not hardened but precise. She took her seat and looked at the room with the unhurried attention of a person who has already read everything that has been filed and has formed preliminary opinions that she intends to test against what she's about to hear. Pierce laid the evidence in order. He did not rush. He had explained to Caleb the night before that the sequence mattered as much as the substance, that evidence presented in ascending order of shock creates a cumulative weight, that evidence presented all at once does not, that the mind needs to be walked up the stairs rather than placed at the top of them. The first item was the photographs of the severed power lines. Pierce set them on the evidence table and addressed the court in the measured voice of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and has learned that calm carries more authority than force. On the night of January 16th, he said, "The power to my client's residence was cut, not by weather, not by equipment failure, by a person or persons who accessed the property without authorization and used a long-handled cutting tool to sever the lines at shoulder height. This is not consistent with accident. The photographs document the cut surface." He moved to the next item. "Beginning on January 14th, my client observed a vehicle conducting surveillance of his property. Black SUV Continental, tires a specific tread pattern documented in these photographs." He set them down. "The vehicle registration obtained through court order last week shows it was leased through a shell company incorporated in Delaware in November of last year. The incorporating attorney for that shell company is the same attorney currently seated at the defense table." One of Warren's lawyers leaned in and said something. Warren did not respond. "The third item," Pierce said, "is the forgery." He set down a document, and beside it a second document, and beside them both a certified report from a forensic documents examiner retained by the court. Eleanor Margaret Holt signed her trust documents in 1987. She signed subsequent modifications in 1991 and 1994. These signatures are documented and certified. The trust management records filed by Warren Holt in 2013, which granted him expanded administrative authority over the estate, contain a signature attributed to Eleanor Holt. Pierce paused. Eleanor Holt died in October of 2012. The signature on the 2013 document was produced 11 months after her death. The gallery was quiet. Warren's hands were still flat on the table. "The fourth item," Pierce said, "is the custody filing." He held up the emergency custody application that had initiated the sheriff's visit to the farmhouse. "This document contains a psychological assessment of my client attributed to a licensed clinical psychologist in Flathead County. The assessment describes a pattern of erratic behavior, violent tendencies, and instability, constituting a danger to minor children." Pierce set it down. "The clinical psychologist whose name appears on this assessment has submitted an affidavit to this court stating that he never examined my client, never met my client, and did not produce this assessment. His signature was applied to a document he did not write." Judge Okafor made a note. Pierce looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to play a recording." He took the flash drive from the lockbox, the one marked with Nora's 2 words, and connected it to the court's audio system. He had unlocked it with Caleb at his office 3 days before following the instructions on the tape, and they had listened to it together in the quiet of his office with the snow coming down outside, and Pierce had sat very still for a long time after it finished before he said anything at all. The courtroom held its breath. Nora's voice came through the speakers. She had recorded it in what sounded like a quiet room, no traffic, no background movement, just the slight compression of a recording device, and her voice, which was thinner than Caleb remembered it, but still unmistakably hers, still carrying the particular cadence of a woman who had decided what she wanted to say and was saying it without performance. "My name is Nora Merritt. I am recording this on March 4th, 2 years before what I expect to happen will happen. I am recording it voluntarily while I am still able to, and I want to be clear about what I am saying and why. My Uncle Warren Holt has been administering a family trust for 11 years that does not belong to him. The trust was established by my grandmother Eleanor Holt for my family. The documents establishing the trust and the documents Warren filed to take control of its administration are not consistent with each other. The inconsistency is not an error. The 2013 signature attributed to Eleanor Holt was applied to a document after her death. I have known this for 2 years. I have spent those 2 years building the record necessary to prove it. I am also recording this because I want to say something about my husband." She paused. Caleb kept his eyes closed. Caleb Merritt is not a complicated man in the way that people who have not met him might assume a man with his history would be. He is not damaged in the way the word is usually used. He is careful. He is patient. He is the most genuinely decent person I have known in my life, which I say not because he is perfect, but because decency in the face of everything he has survived is not a small thing. It is the hardest possible thing, and he does it every day without appearing to notice that he is doing it. If something happens to me, Warren will try to take my children and control my family. He will file documents and make arguments and use the machinery that money makes available to people who know how to use it. I want this court, if it ever hears this recording, to know that everything he says about my husband is a construction. And I want my husband, if he hears this, to know something simpler. You were always the right person. You were always the right choice. The money, the documents, the truth about where you came from, none of it made you who you are. You made you who you are. And who you are has always been enough. Please take care of our children. Please trust the dog. The recording ended. The courtroom stayed quiet for a time that Caleb could not have measured. He opened his eyes. Ranger was pressed against his leg, the full weight of the boy leaning into him, warm and present and steady. Lily was crying in the gallery, not loud, the kind of crying that happens when the body makes the decision without consulting the mind. Owen sat beside her with his jaw set and his eyes very bright, not crying, holding it by whatever means 7-year-old boys hold things. Warren Holt sat at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes focused somewhere near the middle distance that exists between a person and the thing they are looking at but not seeing. His face had the quality of a wall from which something has been removed, a painting or a fixture that had been there so long its absence creates more presence than it occupied. Caleb stood. He had not planned to stand. Pierce had not asked him to speak. He was standing before he had made the decision to stand, and by the time his mind caught up to what his body had done, he was already on his feet, and the room was already looking at him. Judge Okafor watched him with the attention of someone who has decided to allow what is happening. He did not have notes. He did not have prepared language. He had the specific clarity of a man who has been reduced to the essential components of what he believes and is speaking from those components directly. I served for 15 years, he said. I went to places that most people will never see, and I did things there that I will carry for the rest of my life, and I held men as they died on ground that their families back home couldn't find on a map. I came home and I built something, a family, a life, a person I wanted to be in the context of something worth being part of. He paused. My wife built something too. She built it quietly in the time she had left with everything she could bring to it. She built it for our children. She built it knowing she would not see it finished. He looked at the room and then at his children in the gallery. I do not know what I am owed by the law in this room. That is Pierce's work, and I trust him with it. But I know what I owe my children. I know what my wife asked of me, and I will not stand in front of this court and pretend that any document Warren Holt has ever filed represents anything other than what my wife said it represents in that recording. He sat down. Ranger put one paw on top of his boot. Judge Okafor looked at the room for a moment. Then she looked at Warren's attorneys and asked if they had a response. The lead attorney spoke for 11 minutes. His argument was professional and technically detailed and addressed procedural questions in a way that had clearly been prepared with considerable expense and care. None of it moved the air in the room the way the recording had moved it. Judge Okafor recessed for 22 minutes. When she returned, she took her seat and looked at her notes and then looked at the courtroom with the steady attention of a person who has made a decision she is confident in. She dismissed all custody petitions with prejudice. She issued an order referring the forgery evidence to federal prosecutors. She appointed Pierce as sole administrator of the Eleanor Holt Trust pending full legal resolution. She ordered Warren Holt's legal team to preserve all records related to the trust management for the past 11 years. She looked at Warren directly and said in a voice that was not raised that the evidence before the court represented the most deliberate and sustained abuse of fiduciary and legal process she had encountered in 22 years on the federal bench, and that she intended to say so in her written opinion. Warren Holt sat very still through all of this. Lily cried again, this time fully and without apparent concern for who saw it. Owen let out a breath that seemed to have originated somewhere deep in his chest and travel a considerable distance before it reached the air. Ranger stood and turned in a circle and then sat back down and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who considers the matter settled. Warren did not look at Caleb as he left, But he paused at the door of the courtroom, and for one moment he turned and their eyes met across the distance of the room, and Caleb saw in his face something that had not been there in the Holt Estate driveway or on the farmhouse access road. Not defeat in the legal sense. Something older. Something that looked less like the ending of a strategy and more like the ending of something the man had been telling himself for a very long time. Warren turned and went through the door. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after the room had begun to empty, with Pierce's hand briefly on his shoulder and his children making their way down from the gallery and Ranger's warm weight against his leg, and he allowed himself one full breath. Just one. Then he stood up and went to his children. He went to the ridge before sunrise. The night before had been clearer, the first fully clear night in more than 2 weeks, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that produces a specific quality of silence, the silence of air that has gone still and frozen in place and holds sound differently than warmer air does, closer and more present. Stars over the Flathead Valley on a night like that are not a backdrop. They are a presence. Ranger walked ahead of him on the trail, moving with the careful efficiency of a dog whose joints feel the cold on the uphill, but who has decided that this is not the day to accommodate that fact. His muzzle was grayer than it had been a year ago. His left hind leg favored slightly on the ascent. He did not slow his pace. They reached the ridge as the first gray began at the eastern horizon. Nora's marker was where he had placed it the previous autumn, simple pine the letters carved himself. The snow around it was undisturbed, except for the tracks of something small that had passed in the night and moved on. He crouched in front of the marker. For a moment he said nothing. He had learned in the field that the most important communications were often the ones that waited for the right conditions before they happened, and that trying to force them produced something that sounded like the thing, but was not it. He waited. "I got your letters," he said. "Both of them. I read the second one in the barn at 2 in the morning with my hands shaking and Ranger sitting on my feet." He paused. "I wish you had told me sooner. I would have understood. I would have fought beside you from the beginning, and I would have been afraid for you, but I would have understood." Wind moved through the trees below the ridge, a slow and distant sound. "The kids are okay. Owen is getting better at hiding what he feels, which is both a good sign and something I need to watch. Lily wears your shawl when she needs to feel close to you, which I think she figured out on her own." He stopped. "They're good. They are genuinely good, and that is your work as much as mine." He put his hand flat against the pine marker. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he said. "I have thought about what I would have done differently if I had known, if I had pushed harder on the things you deflected, if I had been paying closer attention to what you were managing alone. I don't have an answer that satisfies me. I don't think I ever will." He stayed there for a moment with his palm against the cold wood. Then something moved in his peripheral vision. Ranger had lifted his head and turned it toward the tree line to the north, ears forward, body still. Not the posture of threat, something more neutral, more attentive. He held it for 3 seconds and then exhaled through his nose and returned to his position at Caleb's side. Caleb looked toward the trees. The footprints he had found near the marker 6 weeks before had not returned. The fabric that had caught on the rock, the same gray herringbone as Warren's coat, was gone, reclaimed by weather or by the person who had left it. The ground near the marker was clean. He felt the difference between the visit today and the visit 6 weeks ago, the way fear had lived in the first one. Underneath everything, the awareness of being watched in a place that should have been private. That was gone now. What remained in its place was not quite peace, because peace suggested a settling that he was not certain was available to him, but it was something adjacent to it. The thing you find when the acute phase of a danger has passed and you have survived it and are standing in the place where it used to live and finding that the place itself is simply ground, simply trees, simply cold air, and the beginning of a Montana morning. He stood. Ranger fell into step beside him for the descent. Halfway down, the flash came. Sand, heat, the particular smell of a place he had not thought about in weeks. A sound that was not the wind in the pines, but something sharper, shorter. His hand found Ranger's fur before his mind issued the instruction. He gripped it. Cold, coarse, real. He breathed. 2 breaths. The pines came back. The path came back. The gray morning light came back. He exhaled and continued walking. Ranger matched his pace and did not make a production of it. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the sky had moved from gray to the pale gold that precedes full sunrise in the valley, and the frost on the roof caught the light and held it briefly before it faded. And somewhere in the kitchen, his children were making the kind of noise that indicated cereal was being debated. The ghosts in his chest were still there. He knew they would be there for a long time, but they were no longer the first thing present in a room when he entered it. He went inside to his children. Warren came in spring. The snow had retreated to the north-facing slopes, and the creek was running high with melt, and the valley floor had that particular green that exists for only a few weeks between the end of winter and the beginning of the dry season, the specific green of land that has been cold for a long time and is now releasing what it held. Caleb saw the car coming up the access road in the afternoon and recognized it and stood on the porch and waited. Warren parked at the gate and got out alone. He was smaller than he had been in January. Not in any physical sense that Caleb could have measured, but in the sense of dimension that a person occupies the space they take up in a room or a yard or a conversation. Warren had occupied considerable space in January. He occupied less now. He walked from the car to the gate with the careful bearing of a man who is not entirely certain of his welcome and has decided that certainty is not something he is entitled to request. He stopped at the gate. Ranger stood at Caleb's side and watched him. "I came alone," Warren said. "I can see that," Caleb said. Warren looked at his hands, which were at his sides. "I know that whatever I say here is insufficient. I know that. I want to say it anyway because I think I owe you the attempt, even if the attempt doesn't close anything." Caleb waited. "I have been managing that trust for 11 years in a way that I told myself was responsible administration." Warren's voice was careful and even, but the professional polish had been removed from it. What was underneath was something less constructed. "Nora confronted me about it 3 years ago. She was sick, and I thought that meant the issue would resolve itself." He stopped. "That is the worst thing I have done, not the forgery, not the custody filing, deciding that her illness was a solution." He looked at Caleb directly. "She was the only person in that family who was worth the name," he said. "I knew that. I have known it for years, and I spent 11 years in conflict with her over money that I could have released at any point." He was quiet for a moment. "I also knew about your parentage for 8 years. I had the DNA records. I suppressed them because releasing them would have required releasing the trust, and I was not willing to do that." Caleb stood very still. "I cannot give you back what that cost," Warren said. "I understand that. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm not certain I deserve the attempt. I came because Lily called me." He looked somewhere past Caleb's shoulder. "She called me 2 weeks ago. She asked if I wanted to know how she was doing." Warren's voice changed on this, became something stripped of its remaining control briefly. "She said her mother would have wanted us to try." The yard was quiet. Ranger had not moved. He watched Warren with the complete and unblinking attention of a dog who has assigned himself the specific responsibility of monitoring this situation and intends to take it seriously. Caleb looked at Warren for a long moment. "If you come here," he said finally, "they decide what they're comfortable with. Not you, not me, them. If they want to know their grandfather, that's their choice. If they decide they don't, you accept that and you don't push." Warren nodded. "Supervise," Caleb said. "For as long as it takes, until they say otherwise." "Understood," Warren said. Caleb stepped off the porch and opened the gate. From inside the house, he heard the sound of Owen calling to Lily, and then the back door opening, and then 2 sets of footsteps on the side path. They appeared around the corner of the farmhouse and stopped when they saw Warren, and for a moment everyone stood in the spring afternoon and no one spoke. Lily took a step forward. She did not run. She walked with the deliberateness of a 9-year-old who has thought about this moment and decided how she wants to conduct herself in it. She stopped 2 feet from Warren and looked up at him with her mother's eyes. She said, "Mom said you were complicated." Warren looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." She said, "We're going to try." She held out her hand. Warren looked at it for a moment. Then he took it carefully, the way a person takes something they are aware they might not deserve to hold. Ranger watched from the handshake with complete attention and then, without fanfare, lay down on the path and put his head on his paws. It was not forgiveness, not in any complete sense. It was not the ending of what Warren had done or the undoing of what had been lost. It was the thing Nora had described in the barn letter, not a world free of pain, but a world where love still had room to grow, despite it, and Caleb stood in the spring yard and felt the specific weight of a woman who had built this moment from a dying room and trusted him to arrive at it. He thought she would have stood exactly here. He thought she would have been pleased. The land was broken ground when they started. Not in the agricultural sense, though. That, too, the north pasture had not been worked in years, and the soil was compacted and depleted in the way of ground that has been ignored rather than rested. Broken in the sense of a place that has been holding damage for longer than it should have, that has needed attention it was not given, that has been waiting. Merritt Ridge Veteran and K-9 Recovery Center broke ground on the first day of June. Caleb had spent 3 months with Pierce and an architect from Missoula working through what the trust documents allowed and what the land required and what he believed the place needed to be. He had been deliberate about the design in the way he was deliberate about things that mattered, which was to say he had spent more time on it than most people would have considered necessary and had asked more questions than the architect had initially expected, and the result was a plan that worked with the land rather than against it, that kept the old farmhouse foundation as the center of the main building, that incorporated the barn rather than replacing it. The wood stove from the main room was reinstalled in what would become the community gathering space. The floorboards around the old fireplace were rebuilt. The place where the boards had given way was marked with a different wood, slightly lighter in color, a deliberate distinction rather than a concealment. Caleb had made this decision himself when the builder asked how he wanted it handled. "Let it be visible," he had said. "It matters that it happened here." Construction trucks and survey equipment came up the access road that had been frozen ruts in January and was now graded gravel. Workers from Whitefish and Kalispell, 2 men who had served with Caleb in different contexts and had heard about the project through the specific network of people who keep track of each other after service. A retired engineer from Missoula who came out on weekends because his son had gone through something similar and he wanted to be useful. People arrived. This was the thing that surprised Caleb. Not that help came because Pierce had offered resources and the trust made logistics possible, but that people came who had no obligation to come, who came because they had heard about a man trying to build something in the valley and decided that this was a project they wanted to be part of. The pastor from the community church in Whitefish appeared one morning with a truck bed full of lumber and 2 men from his congregation. He did not make a speech. He shook Caleb's hand and looked at the construction and said she would be proud of this, and then went to find where the lumber was most needed. Owen had appointed himself Ranger's assistant for construction days. He moved through the site at the dog's side, mimicking commands, practicing the specific hand signals Caleb had taught him, correcting his own form with the seriousness of a child who has decided on something. Ranger tolerated this with the patience of a senior partner who has assessed the junior partner and decided the investment of time is worthwhile. Lily made a project of the trees along the south fence. She gathered names from the families of veterans in the valley, and she wrote each name on a strip of cloth, blue and white, and tied them to the branches in a line that would be visible from the main building. She worked at this over several afternoons without telling anyone why, and when Caleb finally asked, she said, "So they're here too," and he had nothing to add to that. The first residents arrived in September. 4 veterans referred through the VA's Community Partnership Program. A former Marine from Billings with a traumatic brain injury and a mind he had acquired 2 years earlier, and could not explain but would not surrender. A female combat medic from Missoula who had been managing a sleep disorder for 6 years through means that were not sustainable. A firefighter from Kalispell, not a veteran, but a man who had been inside a building when it decided to stop being a building and had not found his way back to solid ground since. A 17-year-old from the Blackfeet Reservation north of the valley, whose caseworker had written in the referral that he flinched at raised voices and trusted dogs more than people. Ranger assessed each of them on arrival in the way he assessed everything systematically, thoroughly, and without apparent judgment. He accepted the Marine's dog with one sniff and a mutual shoulder press that settled something between the 2 animals without drama. He sat with the medic for 40 minutes on her first evening while she sat on the porch and did not talk, and he did not leave until she went inside. The 17-year-old came out to the training yard on the 3rd day and stood at the fence watching the dogs work. Ranger noticed him and detached from the drill and walked to the fence and sat on the other side of it. They looked at each other for a while. The boy put his hand through the fence. Ranger pressed his muzzle into the palm. The boy's name was Marcus. He stayed for 3 months. He came back the following spring to help with the new intake group. This was how the thing grew, not through announcement or design, but through the specific multiplication of one person being met, where they were and going back out into their life carrying something that had not been there before, and sometimes the thing they carried was knowledge of a place where they could send someone else. A year after the ground was broken, Caleb stood on the south side of the main building in the October afternoon and looked at what had been built. The gathering room with the wood stove visible through the windows. The training yard where 2 dogs worked a course in the slanted light. The barn rebuilt and open now, where 3 veterans were working on a vehicle restoration project that had no purpose beyond the working on it and the value of having something that required attention and patience and produced results you could measure with your hands. The line of cloth strips on the south fence moving in the light wind, white and blue, each one a name. Owen was in the training yard moving through the course with Ranger at his heel, his commands precise and unhurried, his form recognizable. He had been working at it for months, and it showed. Lily sat on the fence of the south pasture with Marcus and a girl who had arrived 3 weeks ago from Missoula and had not yet said much, and they were watching something Caleb couldn't see from where he was standing. Something in the middle distance that had caught all 3 of them at once and held their attention in the companionable way of young people who have decided they are comfortable in each other's company. Caleb watched all of this for a while. He was thinking about the farmhouse floor that had given way in the dark and the box that had waited beneath it and the woman who had put it there. He was thinking about a letter written in a barn in winter about the word enough and what a person means when they use it. He was thinking about an iron gate in a January storm and a truck heading north on a county road and a dog in the back seat holding steady. He did not hear Ranger approach until the beast was beside him, and even then it was only the warmth at his leg that told him. The dog was carrying something in his mouth. Caleb looked down. Ranger set it carefully at his feet the way he set things he had been asked to retrieve with the precise and unhurried care of an animal who understands that the thing he is carrying is important and behaves accordingly. It was a small metal tin, the kind that had once held something practical, tobacco or salve or boot polish, the label long gone, the surface worn to a uniform mat by decades of handling. It was sealed with a strip of folded tape, yellowed and stiff. Caleb picked it up. He looked at Ranger, who sat and watched him with the expectant attention of a dog who has done the finding and is now waiting to see if the person who received it understands what they've been given. He opened the tin. Inside, nested in a piece of folded cloth, was a ring. Gold, simple, worn thin on the inner surface, where it had been carried for a long time against warm skin. He recognized it. He had placed it on Nora's finger on a September afternoon in a park in Billings on a day when the weather was exactly right, and she had laughed when he fumbled the box, and Ranger had been there younger and faster and had retrieved the box from the grass before Caleb had time to be embarrassed. Beneath the ring was a piece of paper folded twice. He unfolded it. P.S. it said in Nora's handwriting. I hid this one just for Ranger, because I knew he would find it when you were ready, and I knew he would know when that was better than you would. Wear it on a chain if you want, or keep it in your pocket, or put it on the windowsill where the light hits it in the morning. It doesn't matter where. What matters is that you know it's there. You were always mine, and that doesn't stop. It just changes shape. All my love, always. Caleb stood with the ring in his palm. Ranger sat beside him and leaned into his leg and did not move. Below them, the valley held the October light, amber and long, the particular light of a season that is ending and knows it and has made its peace with that. The south fence with its cloth strips, blue and white, moved in the wind. The training yard, the barn, the line of cabins still under construction to the east timber-framed windows beginning to go in. Everything that had been built from what had been broken. He put the ring on the chain beside the dog tags and held it for a moment against his chest. Then he put it under his shirt where it rested warm against his sternum, and he breathed the cold October air, and he looked at everything his wife had built from the time she had left and everything he had built from what she had left him, and he stood in it. Ranger looked up at him once. Then the dog turned and walked back toward the training yard where Owen was running the course, and Caleb watched him go. The graying muzzle, the slight favor in the left hind leg, the scar barely visible beneath the thick fur of his shoulder. Moving with the purpose of a dog who has things to do and intends to do them. Some doors close. Some close hard in the dark with the sound of a lock you did not choose. But sometimes your dog has already been to the other side of the wall, and sometimes he waits for you there patient and certain until you find your way through. Ranger barked once, sharp and clear and certain. The sound carried across the valley and up the ridge and into the cold October air, and then the air held it for a moment and then let it go. If this story moved, you drop a one in the comments. And if you want more stories about people who fought back the right way and built something worth having, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.